The rack. Another feared punishment associated with the Tower of London was the rack, a torture device used across many periods of history. It was primarily designed to force confessions from criminals, enslaved people, and prisoners of war. The device resembled a large wooden ladder, but its rollers were connected to a ratchet system. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were secured with ropes, while officials slowly tightened the mechanism. With each turn, greater pressure was placed on the shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows. Although the purpose was to extract information, the method rarely guaranteed the truth. Under extreme pain, many prisoners simply confessed to whatever the officials wanted to hear. Sometimes the torture produced a confession and the prisoner was released. In other cases, officials accused the victim of lying and continued the punishment. Those who survived were often left with dislocated joints, permanent injuries, or complete paralysis. One of the most famous victims was 25-year-old Anne Askew. In 1546, she was tortured on the rack for hours until her joints were dislocated and she could no longer walk. Her injuries were so severe that she had to be carried to the execution site in a chair, where she was burned alive at the stake. All of this happened because Anne had read, memorized, and privately shared passages from the Bible with a small group of women. Even under torture, she refused to reveal their identities. During this period, openly following beliefs outside the authority of the Catholic Church could bring severe punishment. Such beliefs often had to remain secret, even from family members, and Anne's own husband reportedly played a role in turning her in, crushed by elephants. At this point, survival was no longer part of the punishment. Execution by elephant was used across several Asian kingdoms, including India, and continued into the 19th century. Victims could be sentenced for crimes such as theft, rebellion, military betrayal, or refusing to pay taxes. The condemned person was placed beneath a trained elephant, which would crush the body under its enormous weight. Some rulers even turned these executions into public spectacles. One of the most disturbing accounts claims that Mughal Emperor Jahangir ordered large numbers of prisoners to be crushed for his own amusement. Failing to pay taxes could get a person crushed. Stealing food from a market could get a person crushed. Even relatively minor offenses could result in the same sentence. Meanwhile, someone guilty of a far more horrifying crime might escape punishment entirely, depending on the ruler's mood or personal favor. In other words, justice was not always based on the seriousness of the crime. There were several ways this public execution could be carried out. One detail remained the same in every execution. A handler sat on the elephant and controlled its movements. This was deliberate, as the spectacle was meant to display the power of the ruling class and its ability to command such a massive animal. The quickest method was the one a condemned prisoner could only hope for. His hands were tied behind his back, his head was placed on a raised block, and at the handler's command, the elephant crushed it beneath its foot. The second method was far more brutal. The condemned person was forced to lie flat on the ground with their hands tied behind their back while the elephant was guided across the body. If the first pass failed to kill them, the animal could be turned around and made to repeat the process until the execution was complete. The final method was the most prolonged and horrifying. A highly trained elephant was commanded to crush the victim limb by limb, beginning with the arms and legs before using its tusks to inflict further injuries. Only after extending the suffering would the handler order the final blow to the head or torso. This theatrical form of execution was sometimes used by rulers as a public display of absolute power, turning the victim's death into a spectacle for the crowd. Poena Cullei. Poena Cullei is Latin for penalty of the sack, though the punishment was far more horrifying than the name suggests. It was reserved for those convicted of murdering a close family member. The practice appeared in ancient Rome and was later revived in parts of Germany. The condemned person was sealed inside a thick leather sack, along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. The choice of animals was symbolic, but it also made the execution even more chaotic and terrifying. Once the animals were forced inside, the leather sack was tightly sewn shut, leaving almost no room for air. But the punishment did not end there. The sealed bag was then thrown into a river or the sea, where the condemned person drowned alongside the animals trapped inside. In later periods, some offenders were reportedly given another choice: death inside the sack or execution in the arena, where they could be mauled by wild animals before a public crowd. Either way, the sentence was designed to be both brutal and humiliating. Gibbeting. Gibbeting remained in use in some regions until the early 20th century. One of its final documented appearances occurred in Afghanistan and gained wider attention after National Geographic published a photograph of it in 1921. The punishment was also occasionally used in colonial America during the 17th and 18th centuries. In one notable example, the bodies of convicted pirates were displayed near Boston Harbor, serving as a grim warning to every sailor approaching the city. England became particularly associated with this form of punishment. It was used against traitors, murderers, pirates, and thieves. After the Murder Act of 1752, convicted murderers could be subjected to public dissection or displayed in a gibbet after execution, and more than 130 confirmed cases followed. The most common gibbet was an iron cage shaped closely around the human body. It was designed to hold the prisoner or corpse firmly in place, leaving almost no room for movement. The cage was then suspended more than 30 feet above the ground, usually beside a public road or near a frequently used water source, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness the punishment. Anyone passing by would be forced to confront the horrifying sight, while the condemned prisoner remained trapped above them, desperately begging for food, water, or mercy. The suffering did not end with the prisoner's death. In many cases, the body was left inside the cage to decay for years, exposing nearby residents to the constant sight and smell of death. Some accounts claim that human remains stayed suspended in these cages for decades before officials finally removed them, turning the punishment into a prolonged warning for the entire community. Keelhauling. Keelhauling was a brutal naval punishment used against sailors accused of theft, violence, or serious misconduct. In many cases, the punishment proved fatal. The sailor's arms and legs were bound to a rope that passed beneath the ship. He was then thrown overboard while crew members pulled the rope from the opposite side, dragging his body underneath the vessel and across the keel, the structure that gave the punishment its name. In many cases, the sailor died before even reaching the keel, depending on how quickly and forcefully the crew pulled the rope. Those who survived the initial plunge faced drowning, broken bones from striking the hull, and severe cuts from the sharp barnacles covering the ship's surface. If a sailor somehow survived being dragged around the ship, one of several outcomes usually followed. He might be forced to endure a second round, which was often fatal, or be brought back aboard only to die later from infection. Those who survived were frequently left permanently scarred, disfigured, and marked by the punishment for the rest of their lives. Impalement. Impalement was one of the most gruesome and merciless punishments on the list. It was used by several civilizations throughout history and remained in use in parts of Egypt during the 17th century, often against highway robbers, grave thieves, and those accused of rebellion. The condemned person was forced to lie face down with their hands bound behind their back. The executioner then prepared the lower body to reduce immediate bleeding, before inserting a long wooden stake, sharply tapered at one end and nearly as thick as a man's arm. The executioners then struck the wooden stake repeatedly with a heavy mallet, forcing it deeper into the body. The stake was often greased beforehand to make the process easier and prolong the punishment. Once it emerged through the shoulder, head, or mouth, death was usually inevitable. The victim's body was then raised beside a busy road and left on public display, serving as a terrifying warning to anyone who considered breaking the law. The body could remain on display for an entire day before being removed the following morning. However, another version of the punishment was designed to prolong the victim's suffering. In these cases, the stake was inserted only far enough to hold the condemned person in place without causing immediate death. Some stakes included a support that prevented the body from sliding farther down. The victim was then displayed beside a busy road, where they could remain alive for hours, pleading for help before eventually dying from their injuries. Rat torture. This was one of the most disturbing punishments in history, and several versions of it involved the use of rats. One recorded form dates back to 1568 during the 80 Years' War, when Dutch commander Diederik Sonoy was accused of using it against prisoners. A rat was trapped beneath an overturned clay bowl placed against the victim's stomach, chest, face, or groin. The container was then heated from above with burning coals or a torch. Driven into a panic by the rising heat, the rat searched for the only possible escape route, through the prisoner's body. Once inside, the rat continued clawing and biting through anything in its path, desperately searching for an escape. The animal might eventually survive, but the prisoner rarely did. A second, and even more disturbing variation was later associated with South American military dictatorships. Known as the rectoscope, it involved forcing live rats into a prisoner's body through a tube. This method is most clearly documented in Argentina during the dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, rather than specifically under Augusto Pinochet, who ruled Chile from 1973 to 1990. A tube was placed against the prisoner's lower body, and a live rat was forced inside. Driven by panic, the animal began clawing and burrowing forward, while interrogators continued demanding answers. The full number of victims remains unknown, but this method became associated with the disappearances, torture, and killings carried out under military dictatorships in South America. Scaphism. Scaphism was an ancient Persian method of execution reportedly reserved for serious crimes, such as murder. The condemned person was placed on their back between two hollowed boats and tightly restrained, with the arms, legs, and head left exposed. They were then force-fed large amounts of milk and honey until they became severely ill. The same mixture was spread across the exposed parts of the body, setting the stage for an even more prolonged and horrifying death. Once the preparation was complete, the prisoner was pushed into the middle of a lake and left exposed beneath the intense heat of the sun. But the heat soon became the least of his concerns. The milk and honey were not given as a final meal. The mixture caused severe sickness and uncontrolled waste, while the honey coating the body attracted flies, wasps, insects, rodents, and other animals from the surrounding area. After enduring the animals throughout the night, the prisoner received no relief at sunrise. Each day, he was force-fed another large quantity of milk and honey before the mixture was spread across his body once again. This process was deliberately repeated to keep him alive and prolong the suffering for as long as possible. Insects and rodents continued gathering around the boat, attacking the exposed body and worsening the prisoner's condition with every passing day. The Greek writer Plutarch described one reported case in disturbing detail, calling Scaphism an exceptionally cruel and prolonged form of execution. According to his account, one victim survived for 17 days before finally dying from his injuries. During his final days, the man's face was reportedly covered with insects, while his decaying wounds became infested with parasites and worms. Trapped in his own waste and unable to escape, his death came only after an extended period of unimaginable suffering, the Rat Dungeon. In medieval London, the Rat Dungeon was a name feared by even the most hardened criminals. Located deep beneath the Tower of London, the cell was cold, pitch black, and positioned close to the water level of the River Thames. Prisoners were shackled inside with almost no room to move. Whenever the river rose, rats living along the banks were forced from their shelters and swept toward the dungeon. With no way to escape or defend themselves, the prisoners were left trapped in darkness as the rats entered the cell. The rising water drove the starving, aggressive rats directly toward the dungeon entrance, where they encountered the chained prisoner. Trapped in complete darkness, the victim could see nothing, only hear the faint scratching of tiny feet growing louder by the second. Within minutes, the sound multiplied into hundreds of rats moving throughout the cell. Unable to escape or defend himself, the prisoner was left helpless as the animals surrounded him and began biting at his body. For several hours, the prisoner might have managed to shake the rats away, but exhaustion would eventually take over. Once unconscious, there was nothing left to stop them. By the time he awoke, his body could be covered in hundreds of painful bites. Depending on the crime, prisoners could remain trapped in the dungeon for days or even weeks. Toward the end of the medieval period, the punishment became even more brutal, eventually serving as a form of execution in which prisoners were simply thrown inside and abandoned. The oubliette. The word oubliette comes from the French word meaning to forget, which perfectly describes the purpose of this punishment. Oubliettes were hidden prison chambers used in several parts of Europe, including the Tower of London. One such cell, known as Little Ease, was completely dark, and so confined that a prisoner could neither stand, sit, nor lie down properly. Victims were left trapped in this painful position for days at a time. However, one of the most famous oubliettes was located not in London, but inside Warwick Castle. Deep beneath Warwick Castle lies a narrow stone cell sealed behind a heavy metal door. Prisoners were thrown inside and simply abandoned, exactly as the name oubliette suggests. With no food, water, or chance of escape, death usually came within days, from dehydration or starvation. In many cases, the new prisoner was not alone, as the remains of an earlier victim could still be lying inside the cell. The remains of the previous prisoner served as a constant reminder of the fate awaiting the new occupant. The cell was also infested with rats, which fed on the decaying bodies and attacked anyone still alive. Oubliettes existed in castles across Europe, and later excavations have uncovered chambers containing numerous human remains. These discoveries suggest that many victims were simply abandoned inside and never removed. One of the most disturbing discoveries was made at Leap Castle in Ireland. During renovations in the early 20th century, workers uncovered a hidden opening behind the chapel wall. The shaft dropped several feet into a large underground chamber filled with so many human remains that multiple cartloads were reportedly needed to remove them. Even more horrifying are the stories of prisoners who were not allowed to die quickly. Some were allegedly kept alive for months or even years on tiny amounts of food and water, prolonging their suffering for as long as possible. In certain castles, these cells were built close enough to the surface for prisoners to hear voices, music, and laughter outside, constant reminders of a world they would never return to. Which of these punishments was the most terrifying, and which one would have been the worst to endure? Share the answer in the comments, and subscribe for more dark history, forgotten punishments, and disturbing stories from the past.